This week, we are going to discuss developing interventions, specifically focusing on antecedent-based interventions and an intervention known as functional communication training. So thus far in the course, we discussed functional behavior assessment a great deal, and we learned about all the different methods, the indirect methodology, a descriptive approach, as well as a functional analysis approach, with some of the variations of that approach. So, most importantly, we learned to analyze the functional analysis results and link it to the function of the behavior, that is, the maintaining reinforcers. So, in short, a functional behavior assessment provides information to us with respect to the function of the behavior. That is, what are the reinforcing consequences? Is it social positive reinforcement in the form of attention, or in the form of access to a tangible item? Is it social negative reinforcement in the form of escape or avoidance? Or is it automatic reinforcement? And of course, we know that the functional analysis doesn't make a distinction as to automatic positive versus automatic negative reinforcement. Furthermore, a functional behavior assessment provides us information with respect to the stimulus conditions under which the problem behavior occurs and doesn't occur. So, for example, through an indirect assessment or interview, we may learn via the parent's report that the problem behavior always occurs in school and never occurs at home. That's useful information. Better yet, the functional analysis provides information that the problem behavior perhaps occurs under conditions where there's little to no attention, but never occurs in the toy play condition. So that also provides useful information with respect to developing treatment. So we can't lose sight of the fact that even though we've done a complex analysis like the functional analysis, we're still analyzing all behavior in the three-term contingency. That is, behavior is influenced by the antecedents, the conditions that precede the behavior, and it is maintained by the consequences. And those if the behavior is being maintained, the consequences are reinforcing consequences. So, not only can we analyze behavior using this three-term contingency, but when we start to talk about developing interventions, we are going to look to each end of that three-term contingency in terms of guiding our treatment, making adjustments to antecedents or making adjustments to consequences. So that leaves us with two general strategies for reducing or eliminating problem behavior. There's an antecedent approach, which may entail identifying the antecedents that occasion problem behavior, manipulating those antecedents to attenuate their discriminative properties, teach appropriate alternative behaviors. Next week, we will talk about consequence-based strategies for reducing problematic behavior. Those are going to entail identify the reinforcer maintaining the problem behavior, which a functional analysis does, manipulating those consequences to eliminate the reinforcement contingency. We could arrange new consequences to compete with the reinforcer that maintains the problem behavior, or we could arrange consequences for appropriate alternative behavior. And then, of course, we could arrange other consequences to reduce the problem behavior, and that would be in the form of punishment. We're not going to talk about that just yet, but we will before the end of the semester. So this week, we are going to focus solely on antecedent-based interventions. The article that I assigned was Smith and Iwata 1997, and I didn't assign the entire article because the first part of the article covers a great deal of content that not only can be a little bit confusing for students who are new to the field, but are things that we've covered to a greater or lesser degree. So I will review that content in short, as well as sort of merging it with my own content. But we will certainly cover the interventions that were mentioned in that article. So let's review some of the basics that we know about the variables that influence behavior. And this will focus more on problematic behavior, even though these stand for appropriate behavior as well. So we know that there are antecedent conditions that influence the occurrence of behavior. There are stimuli within the environment that evoke behavior because behavior that's occurred in the presence of those stimuli has been reinforced. So we talk about those in terms of discriminative stimuli, or ST for short. And that is a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement, and as a result, behavior increases in its presence. So some of the examples we discussed with respect to problematic behavior might look a little bit like this. Problem behavior occurs in the presence of teacher 1, but it never occurs in the presence of teacher 2. One of the reasons for that may be that teacher 1 always delivers the reinforcer for the problematic behavior. So let's just say, as a behavior analyst, our treatment involves placing problematic behavior on extinction, that is, no longer reinforcing it. Well, if one teacher continues to reinforce it and the other teacher does not, you would expect the behavior to extinguish in the presence of the teacher who does not deliver the reinforcer. And it would continue to occur in the presence of the teacher who does, because of that teacher is discriminative for reinforcement. If I act out in front of teacher 1, reinforcement will be forthcoming, right? So it's based on history. So obviously people can become discriminative, as well as other stimuli. And we'll talk about some of those on a future slide. Another antecedent condition that is important to consider is the motivating operation. The motivating operation is a concept that was extended from Jack Michael's original concept of the establishing operation. So we currently refer to motivating operation as the broad category, and it has two effects. Motivating operations have a value-altering effect and a behavior-altering effect. If we consider the value-altering effect, there can be an increase in the reinforcing effectiveness of a stimulus, and we're going to call that the establishing operation. And that's what Jack Michael originally conceptualized. There could also be a decrease in the reinforcing effectiveness of a stimulus, and we're going to refer to that as an abolishing operation. Of course, if the value of reinforcement changes from being effective to ineffective, it will influence the amount of behavior that occurs. So the second effect, the behavior altering effect, falls into an evocative effect. There's an increase in the current frequency of behavior, or an abative effect. There's a decrease in the current frequency of a behavior. So these motivating operations are antecedent conditions, some of which can be observed by you as a behavior analyst. So for example, if the student's favorite reward or reinforcer is M&Ms, it makes sense for us to restrict access to those M&Ms, except when we are running the intervention, right? So if I'm using M&Ms to motivate the student to complete work or to engage in good behavior, I'm going to talk to mom and dad and make sure that the student does not receive M&Ms outside of the classroom environment, because that's where I'm using them to motivate. So it creates a state of deprivation, which will increase the value of M&Ms as a reinforcer and should increase the current frequency of the behavior that is reinforced by those reinforcers. Conversely, with that same example, if the student gained access to an entire bag of M&Ms before they came to class, that would decrease the reinforcing effectiveness of M&Ms We call that the abolishing operation. If M&Ms lose their value in that moment, the behavior that's reinforced by those M&Ms is going to decrease, right? So these motivating operations are constantly fluctuating. So if there is a reinforcer operating for a given individual, it stands to reason that the value of that reinforcer is going to change moment to moment. And we're not talking second to second necessarily, but day to day or within the day. You're going to see the value increase or decrease. And of course, the behavior related to those reinforcers will also increase and decrease. And these are transient effects. They change, right? So one thing that's important to consider is some of the time we have control over the motivating operation, right? So if we are using M&Ms as a reinforcer, we can control access to them, and we could create an establishing operation, or we could create an abolishing operation. So that's going to be particularly important for talking about some of these antecedent interventions. Now, in the Smith article, and part of the sections that I did not have you read, he covers several approaches to assessing antecedent conditions. And I'm going to really highlight the functional analysis approach because that's one that we spend a lot of time reviewing in this class. So if you consider the functional analysis and consider it not only an assessment of the function of problem behavior, it also tells us the conditions under which behavior occurs and doesn't occur, the antecedent conditions. And that is because the assessment is designed to systematically control those antecedents. It obviously controls the consequences as well, but and we'll look at each of these conditions once again, but if you go back and review each condition in the functional analysis, you will note that there are sort of these standard antecedent conditions that we as a behavior analyst arrange as part of the test. Each condition, perhaps with the this exception of the alone condition, includes discriminative stimuli. Right? There is a therapist present. The condition is conducted in a particular room. It also includes establishing operations, right? This is how we actually set up the test. We are establishing the potential, the hypothesized reinforcer, right? So if we believe the individual's problem behavior is maintained by attention and we're running the attention condition, by depriving the individual of attention, that is, having a period of no attention, it establishes attention as a reinforcer. So if the problem behavior is sensitive to that reinforcer, it will occur in that condition. So I don't want to get too caught up and go down the road of describing each of the conditions, but the functional analysis manipulates or sets up or contrives each of these variables, the SDs and the EOs. So if problem behavior is occurring in one of the conditions, we know what the SDs and EOs are. There are other antecedent analyses we could do. Some of these may not have direct utility for every case, but you may find yourself utilizing some of these approaches. One of which I think we may have talked about in some detail, Carr and Duran, 1985. So we could essentially conduct an assessment where we're just presenting antecedent conditions and seeing if problem behavior occurs, right? So consider an example where we test demands being delivered to a condition where no demands are delivered. So we could see if problem behavior differentially occurs with respect to demands present versus demands absent. We're not learning anything about the function, and that is an important limitation, but we do learn about the antecedent conditions that influence the occurrence or non-occurrence of the behavior. So we can do that. There's another type of analysis that is mentioned in some textbooks and so forth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you don't really hear many behavior analysts talking about ecological assessments or setting event analyses. You will occasionally hear some BCBAs refer to setting event. So these type of assessments simply observe and describe the environment. They're much like a descriptive assessment. So they're correlational in nature. But when we talk about setting events, some folks refer to setting events as being different than a motivating operation in some way. So they're sort of specific antecedent conditions. Consider like you have a headache, right? So you come to school and you have a headache. Your problem behavior could be related to that condition, right? And they're calling that a setting event. I would refer to it as yet another motivating operation, but some folks will refer to it as something a little different. Lack of sleep, right? If you didn't get a lot of sleep, you may have problems in school or work the next day. So that could be considered a setting event. So I don't want you to get, this will probably be one of the last times you hear setting events, but like I said, there are some folks out there who will still refer to setting events as opposed to motivating operations. So if we know that the functional analysis contains certain establishing operations and certain discriminative stimuli, we know that we can manipulate those, right? So here's your functional analysis protocol. The attention, condition, demand, play, alone. Of course, we know there are other variations of running this analysis, and we know that there are other conditions. But what we're doing here, again, is testing for behavior sensitivity to a given form of reinforcement to see what is currently maintaining that behavior. So if we consider the EOs that are set up in each of these conditions, that gives us some information that we may be able to use in our intervention. So let's say we run a functional analysis and we see the individual has the most problematic behavior in the demand condition. Okay, so we know that the problem behavior is maintained by social negative reinforcement. So we could manipulate the consequence if we had to. But what can we do about the antecedents? Is there anything we could do intervention-wise there? Well, we know that the EO in the demand condition is a delivery of demands. So the therapist is delivering demands. So this is not going to be the most sophisticated intervention strategy, but if we eliminate demands, we probably will have eliminated the occurrence of the problem behavior, right? Because we change the establishing operation. Let's just say we run through a functional analysis and we see that the problem behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement in the form of attention. Okay, so what is the EO? The EO is no attention, right? We set up the condition where the child and therapist are in the session room, and the therapist does not provide attention. They only provide attention if the problem behavior occurs. So, if the problem behavior occurs most in this condition, we know it's maintained by social positive reinforcement, but let's say we want to intervene using an antecedent strategy. What does that intervention look like? Well, if the EO is no attention, if we want to eliminate the problem behavior, what would we do? Right, we would provide attention. So by providing attention, we're eliminating the establishing operation. In fact, we're creating an abolishing operation. So this is sort of a brief introduction to the logic we're going to use here. Now, of course, we know each of the conditions, except the alone, contains other stimuli, right? The presence of the therapist, as I mentioned, presence of specific toys or activity materials, the location of the session, there's instructions delivered. So these may play a role in our antecedent strategies as well. They can. They might not always, but they can play a role. So if we know the function, then we know the conditions under which a challenging behavior occurs and doesn't occur, right? We know the range of stimuli that can be discriminated for the challenging behavior, and we know the reinforcement that maintains a challenging behavior. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this week, but certainly next week we will. So again, I have that example. We break out the demand condition. The EO or the MO is a delivery of demand. So we know that if the problem behavior is occurring in this condition, we know that the MO is a delivery of demands. The possible range of SDs might be that there's a therapist there, there's demand materials. Now, of course, we can't manipulate people. I take that back. We can, but in this scenario, we would not manipulate the therapist necessarily. But we can manipulate demand materials, right? So if specific demands occasion problem behavior, maybe we can alter those demands. Maybe we could identify demands that don't result in problematic behavior and intersperse those demands with the demands that do cause problematic behavior. So now I'm just trying to provide you some broad ideas about the direction we are going to go with intervention. Those are not specific interventions necessarily. Let's talk about antecedent-based interventions. Once again, as I indicated, we're not going to get into great detail about how you would write a protocol to run one of these interventions. I'm trying to give you ideas about the interventions, particularly as they link to the functional analysis. On this slide, I have listed the functions of behavior as well as some interventions. This is by no means an exhaustive list of interventions, but these are the most common ones. So, for social positive reinforcement, some example antecedent interventions include non-contingent reinforcement and functional communication training, or FCT. For social negative reinforcement, the interventions again include non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR, functional communication training, FCT. Also, we have demand fading and something referred to as the high probability sequence. For automatic reinforcement, both positive and negative, we have enriched environment and competing stimuli. There are also a range of consequence interventions, which we'll talk more about next week, but those generally are based on differential reinforcement, DRO, DRAs, extinction, punishment, and so forth. So we'll talk about each of those interventions in the weeks to come. So obviously the goal of our intervention is to reduce or eliminate the challenging behavior. I think in the best case circumstances, we want to eliminate any challenging behavior. That's not always achievable. So we're then working to reduce problematic behavior. And often when we're setting and developing goals on reducing challenging behavior, we reduce them with respect or referencing baseline levels. So for example, we may say that the goal is to reduce Johnny's self-injurious behavior by 90% of baseline levels, right? So I don't know what that is, but it could be that his behaviors are occurring a great deal through the day, and we want there to be no more than 2 instances of problem behavior per day, right? So the goal is a percent reduction from baseline. Whatever the baseline level is, we want to reduce it such that it's clinically significant. Obviously, again, if we could eliminate the challenging behavior, we want to do that. But generally, you see goals written in terms of percentages. And of course, we just reviewed writing goals and objectives in AB 502. We also, once we have an intervention to reduce or eliminate the challenging behavior, we need to adjust that intervention such that it is manageable to implement within the context where it will be operating. So, what I need you to keep in mind as you're reading about these interventions or as I'm presenting them to you is our first goal is to eliminate the problem behavior. The next goal is to adjust the intervention that we're using such that it will work in the context in which the individual lives and the problem behavior is occurring. And it's easy to implement. Most behavioral interventions require effort, right? It's not a medication where we can administer it and walk away and the medication takes effect. Behavioral interventions require somebody to do something. And this is often met with some resistance, right? So if a parent is given a choice to monitor their child's behavior 24/7 or put their child on a medication, the effort involved in monitoring and intervening might be too much. So, we'll talk about that stuff later, but we have to make sure that first we eliminate the problem behavior, then we will make the intervention manageable, or we could say realistic in the real world. Then we want to try to fade the intervention if possible, right? So if we're using reinforcement to promote good behavior, hopefully we don't have to use that forever. We should be able to fade the contrived reinforcers out and more natural reinforcers start to take hold. Okay? So keep that in mind when we go through these interventions. Your first reaction may be, well, nobody's ever going to do that. The job is we will do that, and then we will make the intervention more manageable for somebody else to take over. So that brings us to our interventions. So the first intervention I want to cover is referred to as enriched environment. Enriched environment or environmental enrichment basically involves adding stimuli, usually preferred stimuli, to an otherwise austere environment. Now let me put this in context. Some of the work, or a lot of the work in behavior analysis, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was done with an institutionalized population. So these are individuals with autism and developmental disabilities and or mental health problems who were residing in institutions. And in these institutions, they were the environments were notoriously barren. That is, there wasn't a lot to do, there wasn't a lot of stimulation. And when there's not a lot of stimulation, people begin to engage in stereotypic and or problematic behavior. So it stands to reason that if the environment is not stimulating, if we add stimulation to the environment, that may eliminate or reduce some problematic behavior. So we could simply just add stimuli to the environment to increase adaptive behavior. And of course, if you're engaging with appropriate stimuli like toys or watching a TV program, it's probably going to compete with the occurrence of problem behavior or decrease the occurrence of problem behavior. And we could even make that more powerful if we identify those stimuli via a formal assessment, which we haven't talked about yet, but a preference assessment. Of course, we can make the availability of those stimuli continuous or schedule-based. So let's consider some different examples. I described how this particular intervention may be used in an institutional setting. Now, of course, I've worked with clients in their home settings where there weren't a lot of things to do or activities, whether it's for socioeconomic reasons or maybe the child's problem behavior is so severe that they've broken every toy their parents have ever given them. So the parents refuse to buy more toys. So that obviously that's a different issue. But if there's not engaging stimuli in the environment, we need to identify engaging stimuli and include them. Now, I'm not saying that in every case we do that, but this may be a simple fix. Let's think of another variation. The child has broken all their toys because they engage in problem behavior and they don't have appropriate play skills. So let's identify a highly preferred toy item and teach appropriate play. Now, of course, I'm extending beyond this intervention and starting to discuss teaching appropriate behaviors, but this is sort of one approach, right? So when will we use this? Well, as I mentioned, some of the individuals I've worked with were in institutional settings and they engaged in severe stereotypic behavior, stereotypic SIB. And if there's nothing for them to do, I might recommend an enriched environment. Let's see if we could get them engaged in other things. Another common intervention might be to allow choice, right? So let's think of all the areas you might allow a choice, particularly in an academic environment. You could allow students to select activities that they would like to do first. Maybe they arrange them on the schedule, right? I want to do math first, followed by reading, followed by lunch. Or maybe it has to do with activities, free time activities, or toys, or food items, right? So by allowing choice, we're giving the individuals control over their environment. By and large, you and I have choice to do certain things or not do certain things. Often when it comes to individuals with developmental disabilities, folks tend to sort of run in this gray area of structuring the individual's environment to such an extent that they limit choice. So you'd want to look for that, right? Is there choice? So here, this is just a data set that comes out of an article from 1990 where you could see overall rates of problem behavior are plotted in the dots, the bullet points, and aggressive behaviors are in the bar graph. So when choice is provided for this individual, you see problem behavior. It's sort of variable, but it lowers over time. They go back to a no choice phase. You see problem behavior come up pretty high, and then you go back to choice and problem behavior is reduced. And they show that across 3 individuals. Now, of course, you could see all these results are idiosyncratic. Some individuals show significant reductions in problem behavior, whereas others show moderate reductions in problem behavior. So, as a side note, when you're looking at data like this, ask yourself, is the independent variable having an effect on the dependent variable? And in this case, it is, right? You can see even for George here, his behavior is variable, but when choice is allowed, it's clearly lower than when there's no choice. For Lori, the results are not as pronounced, but you do see lower levels of problem behavior when a choice is provided. So again, we could take this as a general strategy, right? If I'm consulting to a classroom or consulting to a teacher who's doing a one-on-one instruction, and I notice that the child's having problem behavior, I do my assessments, interviews, and I notice the child has problem behavior when math is being introduced. Well, let's see if we rearrange that schedule and allow the student to choose when they want to do math. Will that reduce the problem behavior? So now here's that caveat of our first job is to eliminate the problem, then make the intervention more manageable. So the pieces we need to think about if we allow choice, right? Imagine you're consulting to a classroom and there's 10 kids, one of which is having a problem, and you tell a teacher, well, give them a choice of when to do the tasks that need to be done. That's probably not going to go over well because none of the other kids get a choice. So our goal needs to be to eliminate the problem behavior. So we say, well, let's do this. Just give them a choice. Once we eliminate the problem, now we could start adjusting that intervention such that the intervention is manageable within the environment or that it's faded out altogether. So imagine by providing the choice of schedule, I do A first, followed by B, followed by C, reduces a problem behavior. We get the individual choosing their schedule for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then we reduce the choice, right? And try to get them back on track with the regular schedule, right? Because now they've had a new history where they're choosing activities, presumably if they're complying with the activities or receiving reinforcement, so life has improved. So now maybe we could systematically program the schedule to match the rest of the class. So these are the things, the sort of details that are not being described in this overview. All right, so we talked at length about motivating operations. Well, and specifically establishing operations, how an establishing operation increases the value of a reinforcer and increases the current frequency of behavior maintained by that reinforcer. An abolishing operation decreases the value of a reinforcer and, of course, decreases the frequency of behavior. So now that's interesting because it leads us to a possible intervention. That is, if my problem behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement in the form of attention, that attention only is a high value reinforcer when I'm not getting attention, right? Or when I've had a period without attention. So therefore, I'm going to engage in behavior to access attention. But if that attention is given to me freely, not contingent on behavior, that means the value of it will decrease, right? So I will not engage in problem behavior to get the attention. So as an intervention, our goal would be to identify the reinforcer via functional analysis and then alter the MO, right? We want to set an abolishing operation. So these are pretty effective interventions, and they're all referred to as non-contingent reinforcement. Okay, so if you think of a reinforcement contingency, it is a one-to-one relationship that the problem, or let's just say the behavior occurs and it's followed by reinforcement. So if we're talking about problem behavior maintained by social positive reinforcement in the form of attention, that means the reinforcement contingency is when problem behavior occurs, attention follows. Non-contingent reinforcement means we are going to deliver that reinforcer for free. So obviously, when we're talking about non-contingent reinforcement, it means that we have access to and can control the delivery of the reinforcer. So often, they're response-independent deliveries of reinforcement on a time-based schedule. Now, I don't know if you've covered time-based schedules in ABA 503. You will cover them at some point. You'll have a better understanding of what we mean here. But a lot of these interventions are run on interval schedules, time-based, or ratio schedules. So for NCR, it's a time-based schedule. So fixed interval means we pick a time. Let's just say a fixed interval, 30 seconds. And that means every 30 seconds, we are delivering the reinforcer. And what that ends up doing is satiating the individual on the reinforcer, thereby decreasing its value thereby decreasing the frequency of behavior that's maintained by the reinforcer. So there are a couple variations that relate to the specific area here. Non-contingent attention, you're going to deliver attention on a time-based schedule, or non-contingent escape, deliver escape on a time-based schedule. So let's look at a data set from Seungwoo Kang that's referencing NCR for behavior maintained by social positive reinforcement. So on the left, you see the functional analysis graphs, and these data are showing, at least for this participant, Julia, that problem behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement. Why? Because it occurs most in the attention condition, and that is a test for social positive reinforcement. So now we have some baseline. Our problem behavior is roughly around, somewhere between 3 to 6 behaviors per minute, responses per minute. And if we deliver attention non-contingently, I forget the details of this study, but let's just say we deliver attention every 30 seconds. That eliminates the problem behavior. Why? Because the EO is the absence of attention. So if we're delivering attention for free, that means the person is being satiated, right? They're getting all the attention they could possibly want. So therefore, attention is not valuable, and you will not act out to get attention. Okay, we see that replicated across a couple of participants. And this is only one example data set. There are hundreds of studies showing the effects of non-contingent reinforcement. So once again, I want to highlight that results of interventions like this are often idiosyncratic. Of course, we have to know what the function is before we could implement this type of an intervention. Okay, so you see a pretty effective intervention. Here's another example. Actually, I'm sorry, two different examples. Looks like Susan's problematic behavior is also maintained by attention, but Matt is maintained by access to a tangible item, right? So the non-contingent reinforcement is in the form of the delivery of a tangible item. Let's just say Matt acted out to gain access to his iPad, right? Under baseline, he's engaging in a lot of problem behavior. He's gaining access to the iPad. But now what we do is try to break that contingency. And we do so by giving him access to the iPad, maybe initially all the time. And then we change it perhaps to a schedule where we control when he's getting the iPad, but he's getting it not contingent on behavior, but dependent on the time schedule. Here's another example of non-contingent reinforcement for behavior maintained by social negative reinforcement. And this comes from an article described by Tim Vollmer and colleagues in 1995. So again, on the right, or on the left rather, you have your functional analysis data, both of which are showing problem behavior being maintained by social negative reinforcement in the form of escape. So what Vollmer does here is utilizes non-contingent reinforcement, or a specific variation known as non-contingent escape. So we have our baseline and responses per minute, roughly somewhere around 2 self-injurious behaviors per minute. When we introduce non-contingent reinforcement, we see an immediate reduction in SIB. These numbers above each data point is referencing the non-contingent reinforcement schedule. So you can see they actually do what's called schedule thinning very quickly in this process. C refers to continuous reinforcement. So imagine this is a classroom environment, right? So for the first non-contingent escape session, Kevin here doesn't have to do any work, right? It's a break, 100% of the session. The next one, it's 10 seconds, right? So 10 seconds of escape, then maybe he has to work. So what they're doing is adjusting the schedule here, and they get it up to 1 minute and 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So this is a schedule with which the reinforcement would be delivered here every 3 minutes, here every 10 minutes. So according to the schedule, he's getting an escape, at least let's go here, every 3 minutes. So he works, then 3 minutes elapses, hey, take a break. He works 3 minutes, hey, take a break. Right, so what we're doing there is we are controlling the delivery of the reinforcer. We're delivering it for free. He's not required to engage in problem behavior to access the reinforcer anymore. We change the contingency. Okay, we see another example down here for Mark, similar thing. And again, I want you to note the fading process or the reinforcement thinning process. So we start with continuous schedule, and then we thin the schedule to something that is manageable in the given environment. Here's another set of data from Jenna Lindberg, where problem behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. So we have 3 participants here. Problem behavior is maintained, occurs most in the alone condition, so that is automatic reinforcement. We don't know if it's automatic positive or negative. I'd say Robert's data down here are a little undifferentiated, but as mentioned, sometimes that seems to be indicative of an automatic reinforcement function. Furthermore, it looks like they ran a couple repeated alone conditions. So, what does non-contingent reinforcement look like for automatically maintained problem behavior? Well, this is sort of tricky, and we're going to talk about this in a couple weeks, specifically I think in 2 weeks. So with automatic reinforcement, we don't have access to the reinforcer. So how can we administer it non-contingently if we don't have access to it? Well, in 2000, we'll talk about this article, but there is a procedure where we can identify items that may compete with the reinforcement produced by a given behavior. So if a behavior is automatically maintained, we might hypothesize some of the sources of reinforcement. So let's just say an individual's problem behavior in the form of ear clapping is maintained by automatic reinforcement. Well, let's look at that behavior of ear clapping. We'll say it's forceful contact of the hands, open hands, clapping against both ears. The source of reinforcement, it's automatic, or at least it could be via the functional analysis, but the source may be the sound that's produced by the clapping, or it could be the sensation that's produced by the clapping. So we're getting into a little bit more of a hypothesis, an educated guess as to what is a sensory stimulation. And if we can identify that, or at least hypothesize, maybe we could identify stimuli that produce similar sensation, right? Let's come up with another example. Person who engages in automatically reinforced eye poking. Well, eye poking has been shown to produce visual stimulation to the ocular cortex, visual cortex. So maybe we can get a toy that has bright blinking lights, and that produces similar stimulation. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. So implementing NCR under that arrangement would be we deliver these items on a time-based schedule. right? So maybe initially we have the object available all the time. And you can see here for Julie that when an object, presumably one that matches the sensory stimulation of the behavior, when it's delivered, object manipulation is high, SIB lowers. They do a reversal to baseline, we recapture baseline levels, and we reintroduce the treatment. So pretty clear demonstration that by providing an item non-contingently, SIB goes down, object manipulation goes up. So again, obviously we have to identify this object very formally. Can't just pick one. We have to do a formal assessment. And we see that replicated across a couple individuals, right? So the goal here is identify the function. If it's automatic reinforcement, let's conceptualize what the automatic reinforcer is. Is that behavior producing sensory stimulation? If so, is there an item or is there something we could do that matches that stimulation? And there's been a couple variations of this with behaviors such as hand mouthing, individuals playing with their own saliva. They'll use things like, you could play with soap as opposed to your saliva. So sometimes you have to be creative with what the stimulation is going to be. But again, the goal here is to eliminate the problem behavior. So do you want somebody to play with a puddle of their own saliva or a little bowl of dish soap, right? So I would say the dish soap is obviously more hygienic. So let's get them to do that, eliminate the problem behavior, and then we'll see if we can get them to engage with something a little more appropriate, right? That is not dish soap. So the considerations with NCR, obviously first and foremost, we have to identify the function of the behavior to know what reinforcer we're going to deliver non-contingently. Then we want to determine a schedule upon which we are going to deliver the reinforcer non-contingently. So I'll talk about this in more detail later. I'll give you sort of an introduction now. Typically what we do is we choose a schedule reinforcement that is dense to begin with. Obviously the schedule that's most dense would be continuously. So continuous non-contingent reinforcement. We may not always need to start there, but if we do, we could be confident that we will eliminate the problem behavior. So let's just say we start with continuous reinforcement. Then we need to thin the schedule reinforcement. We need to get that reinforcer on the schedule from being available 100% of the time to being available intermittently based on a schedule. Every 30 seconds, every 1 minute, every 5 minutes, maybe variable every 10 minutes. So that's sort of the goal. Another thing I'll talk about with respect to determining the initial schedule. One of the things we do is determine the average inter-response time, or IRT. Those of you who are in 502 know what this is. Those of you who are not, or do not recall from 502 what an IRT is, it's the inter-response time. So if we are measuring the occurrence of behavior in a given condition, and we're using technology, so let's just say we have a handheld device or a laptop where we're hitting a key each time we observe behavior occurring. There are programs out there that can determine what is the average time between each response. So if we learn that self-injury occurs on average every 2 minutes, our initial IRT for non-contingent reinforcement should be less than 2 minutes, right? Let's just say 1 minute, because that will create a higher probability that the individual will contact the reinforcer before they engage in the problem behavior. And that's sort of the goal. Okay, some of the strengths of non-contingent reinforcement. It's effective, right? If we know what the reinforcer is and we deliver it freely, we are essentially breaking the problem behavior reinforcer contingency. It tends to be easy to implement. And we will contrast this with differential reinforcement, we'll talk about next week, where you have to monitor the person all the time to determine whether or not a behavior occurred or didn't occur before you deliver the reinforcement. Well, in this case, if the reinforcers deliver non-contingently, we don't really have to observe. We don't care whether the behavior occurred or not. We're just piling on the reinforcers to decrease the value of the reinforcer. And it's based on positive reinforcement. That's always considered a good thing. The limitations are there's a risk of what we call adventitious reinforcement. So let's just say you have an NCR schedule at a fixed interval 30 seconds, and at second 28, the individual engages in self-injurious behavior, and you are scheduled to deliver reinforcement at 30 seconds. That could reinforce the problem behavior, which obviously we don't want to do. So some folks will use a delay, right? If the interval times out and the individual's engaging in problem behavior, they may wait 3 to 4 seconds before they deliver the reinforcer. It could reduce motivation to engage in adaptive behaviors, right? So if the same reinforcers that maintain problem behavior also motivate people to engage in appropriate behavior, if we're giving away those reinforcers for free, it may decrease their motivation. I haven't really seen any empirical support for this, but I guess it's worth considering. The other thing is NCE, specifically non-contingent escape, disrupts learning initially, right? So if we're giving somebody constant breaks between work, that is disruptive to an individual's work or learning environment. So again, we have to make this intervention, we have to adjust it to make it more manageable. And that is sort of the real work to be done in behavior analysis, right? We could eliminate the problem behavior with the intervention. The real work is, can we fade the intervention out or make it more manageable in a natural environment? So we've seen a couple different approaches using non-contingent reinforcement for social positive reinforcement, social negative reinforcement, and automatic reinforcement. Demand fading is an intervention that is specifically used, as you can imagine, for problem behavior maintained by social negative reinforcement. More specifically, under conditions where the problem behavior is evoked because of demands. So again, imagine we run our functional analysis, we run a couple different conditions, and we see the most problem behavior in the demand condition. So that tells us that problem behavior occurs when demands are presented and it's maintained by social negative reinforcement. Furthermore, we might learn that problem behavior never occurs in the play condition or the control. And in that condition, there are no demands. So now we know that, well, as long as there's no demands, the problem behavior is not going to occur. So let's see how that can inform intervention. So the intervention known as demand fading would be one where you're manipulating some dimension of a demand to decrease the probability that it will evoke challenging behavior. Okay, I want you to pay attention to that phrasing too, because it's important that you start to acquire that language, that terminology. So the demands evoke the problem behavior. They don't elicit. That would be more respondent in nature. So if demands evoke challenging behavior, what about demands can be manipulated? Well, a couple things. We can manipulate the difficulty of a demand. It could be easy or hard. We could manipulate the frequency of a demand. right? How many demands are being asked of you or delivered to you? We could even vary the instructional quality. Are we saying, do this or else? Or do we say, hey, how about trying this? Right? So we can manipulate those things. So one of the early demonstrations, demand fading, was conducted by Gary Pace et al. In 1994. So this is a data set, and I'll try to explain the intervention by way of reviewing the data. So in this first panel here, we see the functional analysis. And an interesting thing about it is they are using the functional analysis as a baseline. Now that's interesting. Let's talk about that. First, let me describe the FA, and then we'll talk about why the baseline feature is interesting. So they run a couple different conditions. It looks like social disapproval, which is essentially the attention condition. So a test for social positive reinforcement. They run a demand condition, right, which is a test for social negative reinforcement. And they run what they call a conversation condition, which I assume is their control. So not quite the classic control of a toy play, but seems that it entails no demands and a lot of conversation, right? So they're covering both establishing operations, right? They're eliminating them here. Okay. So in the FA, we see that problem behavior occurs exclusively in the demand. Now, another thing they recorded here is the number of demands delivered. And that is this data path here, right, which is plotted on the secondary y-axis. And they did that because of the research question. So we see that when there's a lot of demands being delivered and escape is available for problem behavior occurs. So how can we eliminate the problem behavior by way of an antecedent intervention? Well, we could go from delivering, let's just say, I'm making this up, on average 40 to 45 demands per session. Let's reduce that to 2 demands per session, right? Now, when we do that, we see that problem behavior is low. So let's consider that here we have 10-minute conditions. I'm making this up. I think this is what they use here. So for 10 minutes, you are delivering a bunch of demands, right? And that's evoking problem behavior. Well, now let's just say we only deliver 2 demands in the 10 minutes. The individual complies with both of them, no problem behavior, life is good. Okay? Now we up it to, I don't know exactly what it is, let's just say it's 5. So now we have 5 demands, right? Problem behavior is still low. Let's up it to 10. Problem behavior remains low. So it looks like reducing the number of demands delivered in a 10-minute session reduces problematic behavior. We do a reversal to baseline. This is an experimental design approach. And we see that when we have a lot of demands, problem behavior is high, right? Not quite as high as baseline, but still seems pretty high. They go back to demand fading, right? So they systematically, over many sessions, gradually increase the number of demands delivered. You do another reversal to baseline, then back to demand fading. So, they maintain low levels of problem behavior. So this is a prime example of our first goal is to eliminate the problem. And we do so by eliminating the antecedent condition that evokes the problem. Most parents and or teachers are not going to be happy with that because, well, let's just say this is a classroom environment. The student has to work. They have to work. So I need to convince them, and we'll talk more about this in ABA 511, but as a behavior analyst, I need to say, listen, you spent weeks already where the individual is not working because every time you issue demands, they engage in problem behavior. So they're not really working. So let's take control of the environment, eliminate the demands, and then we're going to systematically increase the demands back into the environment until it's equal to where they should be. Right? So that's what's being done here. Very effective procedure. The key element here is this systematic approach, right? We're systematically increasing the number of demands. Another way you could conceptualize this, or there's actually two ways you can conceptualize it, is not only are we eliminating the demands, but what that does is it eliminates the establishing operation, right? Because if demands are an establishing operation, the more demands I deliver, the more escape as a reinforcer becomes valuable, the more problem behavior you're going to see. So by reducing the number of demands, you're reducing the establishing operation. So that's sort of one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is you have an individual who's engaging in problem behavior when demands are being presented. So there's a long history there. Let's try to give them a new history, right? So the new history is going to be, you do a couple demands, we provide contingent reinforcement for compliance, you're doing great, life is good. Okay, now let's try a couple more demands, and then a couple more. So this gradual introduction or reintroduction of demands is actually sort of, you could consider it or giving a new history, right? One that we sort of set up for them. And I actually just noticed here, I apologize for this, that the problem behavior is obscenities, right? So maybe not severe per se, but certainly disruptive. Okay, another intervention that's sort of similar to the last one of demand fading is it's a fascinating intervention. It's referred to as a high probability request sequence. And here what we're doing is we are going to proceed what we're going to call a low probability request with several high probability requests. So what does all that terminology mean? Well, a high probability request would be a demand that when you issue to the individual, it will likely result in compliance. So for example, if I say to the student, touch your nose, and they do it, that's a high probability request. If I say touch your ears, and they do it, that's a high probability request. If I say complete the math problem, and they don't do it, that is a low probability request. So what this intervention is going to do is arrange a sequence of high probability requests to low probability requests. It's sort of going to be like a ratio. And the concept by which this intervention works is referred to as behavioral momentum. And what we're doing essentially here is creating momentum of SD, the demand, compliance, reinforcement. Demand, compliance, reinforcement, demand, compliance, reinforcement before we throw in this low probability request. Okay, so for example, you deliver 5 high P requests followed by 1 low P. So here's an example data set. And this has been, most of the work in this area has been done by Charles Mace. So here is the data set. And if we look at the y-axis, it's a percentage of compliance to low probability commands. Okay. And then they split those up into do commands, such as do this, and don't commands, don't do this. So we see that the compliance to the low probability demands is relatively low. I would say roughly around 50%. They actually tried an intervention of a medication, and it did change behavior slightly. We might say that compliance is a little bit higher, but really not significantly. Then they try this high probability command sequence. So, going with the example I just provided, 5 high probability followed by 1 low probability. When they apply that sequence to the don't commands, the black circles, you see compliance elevates, right? It increases. Then they apply it to the do commands. You see compliance increase there. They apply it back to the don't, compliance increases. And then they apply to both. And you see both. Compliance increases under both of those arrangements. So very effective intervention, at least in this case, and as in some of the subsequent research that followed this study. But I also want to take this time to point out this experimental methodology we are using to show the effects of our intervention. So we don't have to do this. If we utilize this for a student, we don't have to identify don't and do commands, but this is one way this research group used to illustrate the effectiveness of the intervention. But what you could see is they're systematically applying it to different things, in this case, the 2 different commands, to show that we have control. By using this intervention, we have control over the compliance, that we can increase it and or decrease it. So, very effective intervention. Now, again, obviously what has to happen here is we have to fade or thin the ratio of high probability commands to low probability commands, right? So let's just say we start with this. I'm going to go back a slide with 5 high probability to 1 low probability. And that increases compliance. Let's do that for a couple sessions or maybe a couple days. Then in the session or day that follows, we'll go 4 high probability to low probability, right? Let's just say we get success there. Let's go 3 and 3, right? So what we're doing here is adjusting the intervention. Ultimate goal being we're issuing all low probability requests and getting compliance. So this has been applied to increase compliance when the problem behavior might be non-compliance or they're not a high level of compliance. So it's been used quite effectively there. Some other interventions that can be used, antecedent-based interventions, could be increasing the response effort for the problematic behavior or decreasing response effort for appropriate behavior. So there's been a couple ways this has been demonstrated in the literature, but let's just think of doing this for you and I. Say, for example, you have a sweet tooth and you want to try to cut down on eating sugary sweet items. You can place all your junk food in hard to reach places or give them to your significant other to hide. So what that does is it takes them out of your environment, makes it more effortful to actually gain access to them, right? So your behavior of eating junk food will probably be affected because it's too hard to get, I have an apple right here. The junk food is, in my wife's car and I want to go out there, something like that. So by adjusting the response effort, we can change behavior. So one way we've seen this used in the literature is for behavior known as pica, which is eating inedible objects. So there's, and we'll read a study that looks at pica behavior, but individuals have been shown to eat really anything, rocks, cigarette butts, small pets, things of that nature. So the small pets was sort of a joke, but I'll tell you a story of the population of individuals I've worked with, and one of them ate their fish. So they're out of their fish tank. So interesting. I'll tell you that another time. So nevertheless, the way I've seen response effort used for pica is pica is very dangerous, right? So let's just give the kid a fanny pack with snacks in there when we're in areas where we can't manage their pica or we can't block it physically, right? Let's just give them access to preferred items, and that would compete with their wanting to ingest inedible objects. Another way response effort has been manipulated is by use of what's known as a restraint and restraint fading. So this type of work is something I encountered in hospital settings under the supervision of physicians. So for some individuals who engage in very severe self-injurious behavior or even aggressive behavior, but typically self-injury, they could be fitted with rigid arm sleeves. And these arm sleeves can be made to be more or less flexible, right? So what we try to do when we're using these rigid arm splints is, one, prevent the individual from engaging in self-injurious behavior. Obviously, a specific form of self-injury, hand-to-head hitting. So we want them to have some range of motion so they can do activities of daily living or maybe do schoolwork, but it would be too difficult or too effortful to bend the sleeve to strike themselves in the head. So what that does is it sort of extinguishes the behavior by one. It makes it very effortful to engage in the self-injury, thereby contacting the reinforcer. So it sort of breaks the contingency there. Two, by preventing the behavior, because it's too hard to engage in it, you may actually facilitate the individual contacting reinforcement for appropriate behavior. So therefore, their choice, if you will, sort of allocates to more appropriate behavior and allocates away from engaging in problematic behavior. So very interesting intervention there. We'll see if we can review some literature in the weeks to come. Okay, the last intervention, and perhaps the most important one, is functional communication training. This is actually considered an antecedent-based approach, but it is the mechanism by which it works is differential reinforcement, essentially. So functional communication, I say it's the most important one because loosely speaking, 90% of the time, your intervention for problem behavior will entail functional communication training. Most certainly for socially maintained problematic behavior. So one way that folks have conceptualized some problem behavior is that it is communicative in nature. If you consider the fact that some of the individuals we work with, if they have severe autism or another severe developmental disability, they may also have severe communication deficits. So, for example, when I'm thirsty, if I cannot say that I'm thirsty and request water, I may do other things to get water. And those other things may be appropriate, but if they're not reinforced, then it may develop an inappropriate behavior, right? So imagine if you lost your voice and you cannot, and you were sort of stuck in bed. I guess these days it's you wouldn't want to really imagine that, but nevertheless, if that was a scenario and you were extremely thirsty and you learned that banging on the bed rails got the nurse to come over and bring you water, right? You would bang the bed rails each time you were thirsty. So some individuals do learn inappropriate behavior produces reinforcement, right? So Carr and Duran actually conceptualized some problematic behavior that way, and they developed this intervention, functional communication. So again, it's a differential reinforcement procedure where we teach an alternative response, one that will access the reinforcer, and then we place the problem behavior on extinction. So we're differentially reinforcing the alternative, extinction for the challenging behavior or problem behavior. We say that this alternative response, it's going to be a communication response. The alternative response is functionally equivalent to the challenging behavior. Why? Because it produces the same reinforcer. So again, if you follow my logic, if my problem behavior is maintained by gaining access to attention, somebody could teach me an appropriate means of communication to access that attention. So therefore, I communicate, I get the attention, it's going to decrease the challenging behavior. So we call it functionally equivalent. Okay, so how do you do functional communication training? As you might imagine, we start with a functional analysis to identify the behavior's function. Then we identify a socially acceptable communication response. We'll talk about what those are on the next slide. And then we rearrange a contingency. So if problem behavior produces reinforcement, we are going to place it on extinction. So we're not going to deliver reinforcement for the challenging behavior. We're going to teach a communication response, and that communication response produces the functional reinforcer. So let's just say there's an example of problem behavior maintained by social negative reinforcement in the form of escape. We can teach the individual to request a break instead of engaging in problem behavior. Okay. So let's look at the different functions and then consider the functional communication responses. For social positive reinforcement in the form of access to attention or tangible item, we could teach a request for attention or a request for tangible item, or both. Social negative reinforcement, if it's in a form of avoidance or escape, we could teach a request for continued access or engagement in an activity, right? So that would be avoidance. Let's just say I'm playing and it's time for me to do something else. And I learned that if I bang my head, mom and dad let me continue doing what I want to do. Well, the communication response for that might be exchanging a picture card. Can I have 5 more minutes, please? Right? So escape, request for break, or maybe it's a request for help or assistance. For automatic reinforcement, we might teach a request to gain access to appropriate sensory stimulation, right? So instead of playing with your own saliva, I request the dish soap, right? So I can play with that. So the form of the functional communication response, and all of this comes out of the Tiger, Hanley, and Bruzek article that I assigned. The forms of functional communication can be vocal. It could be a gesture, picture card, or some communication device. It doesn't matter. You probably want to consider how easy can the individual acquire the response, right? If they're nonverbal, a vocal response probably isn't going to be the best approach. If they do have some vocal capabilities, obviously a vocal response is going to be best because it will contact reinforcement in a variety of areas. A gesture, it might be effective, but some people in the community might not know what the gesture means. Picture cards are actually very useful because the picture on the card sort of delineates a reinforcer, right? Maybe the picture card says break please, or says attention please. So that sort of specifies a reinforcer. The Picture Exchange Communication System, or PECS, is an example of picture card communication. So very useful. Or a communication device. So any of these forms are appropriate. Your considerations, as mentioned, include what is the response effort? How effortful will the response be? Remember, consider it needs to be less effortful than the problem behavior. So Let's just say I'm using an iPad to communicate, right? There are little icons in my iPad and I scroll to the page and it says, I need a break, please. But if I bang my head, that produces a break as well. So we need to make sure the response effort is less for the appropriate behavior. And I've actually worked with individuals who have used communication devices like iPads. But the specific reinforcer that maintained their problem behavior, although there was an icon for it on the iPad, it was buried under 2 or 3 different menus. So it required a lot of effort for the individual to scroll through the menu and say, I need a break or I want help. And it's easier to just hit the teacher or the one-to-one that's next to them. So response effort's important. Social recognition equally is important. Obviously, when we're intervening, we know what different things mean, the gestures or the picture card, but will the community at large know what they mean? And we might not be too concerned with that because anybody who contacts the individual would probably be trained on the intervention. Speed of acquisition, right? You don't want to spend 3 and 4 weeks trying to teach a vocal response, break please, or attention please. So pick something that the individual will acquire quickly that will reduce the problematic behavior. Again, we can work on more complex communication responses later. Let's get something very basic. So typically functional communication begins on a continuous schedule. That is, after the functional analysis, we teach the person the communication response, and then under the same conditions that maintain problem behavior, they each time they communicate, the reinforcer should be delivered, right? And then, of course, the reinforcer should be thin. So consider utilizing FCT in the form of break please for a student whose problem behavior occurs in demand conditions. So the problem behavior is maintained by social negative reinforcement. If you teach that student that when you exchange a picture card that says break please to the teacher, you get a 30-second break. What's likely to happen? After that 30 seconds is over, the student's going to hand you the card again and again and again. So you're going to get a lot of communication responses. Now that's good because the individual is communicating to get the reinforcer as opposed to engaging in the problem behavior to get the reinforcer. But it's unmanageable in a natural environment. So we have to figure out a way to thin the schedule to make it more manageable. So we're going to consider what form of reinforcement thinning we're going to use, what's a thinning criterion, and we want to be careful because if we thin too quickly, it could result in deterioration of the functional communication response and resurgence of the challenging behavior.
So let's look at the 2 primary approaches to schedule thinning during functional communication training. So the first approach would be to include a delay to reinforcement following the functional communication response. So for example, it would be time-based, like 5 seconds. In other words, when the client or the participant exchanges or communicates functionally, break please, the therapist would say, nice job asking for a break, you need to wait 5 seconds. Then at the end of the 5 seconds, they would deliver the break. So the time-based schedule obviously can be systematically thinned. We could go from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, obviously contingent on a continued reduction in behavior. So once the client meets the criterion under 5 seconds, we could move it to 10, or you might want to take even smaller steps, right? So let's just say we go to 7 seconds. So now the client communicates with the functional communication response. We say, nice job asking, you need to wait 7 seconds, right? They do that. And then after, say, for example, 3 consecutive sessions where problem behavior remains low, we continue to thin that schedule. In a demand context, we can use sort of like a ratio-based schedule, or really just a ratio schedule, wherein the individual communicates for the break. If this was a social negative reinforcement function, they communicate, break please. We say, nice job asking. You need to do 2 additional problems before you get the break. And then, of course, again, systematically thinning. So the thing to keep in mind with these schedules is we're starting with a dense schedule and we are systematically thinning the schedule based on a criterion. And that criterion often is referencing some level of problem behavior, somewhere low to no problem behavior for X amount of time. So if we're doing session-based work, problem behavior remains at 0 for 3 consecutive sessions, and then we adjust the schedule, right? Another 3 consecutive sessions where problem behavior is low, we adjust the schedule again. So it's a systematic approach. Another approach that has been favored was described by Greg Hanley et al., and it's using what's called a multiple schedule. A multiple schedule is a schedule of reinforcement that has more than one component, and each component is indicated by a different stimulus. So, in other words, with this approach, we are going to use additional stimuli. Let's just say we use construction paper, a red piece of construction paper and a green piece of construction paper. And we're working at the desk with the client. And let's just say we're doing FCT for problem behavior maintained by social negative reinforcement in the form of escape. So we teach them to exchange a break card to access escape. Initially, it starts on a continuous schedule. Every time they exchange a card, we give them a 30-second break. Then we repeat that. Under the mixed schedule, what we're going to do is alternate periods of extinction with periods of reinforcement, right? So in other words, when the red card is present, if you use your break card, there's no break. I'm not delivering the reinforcer. When the green construction paper is present and you use your break card, I will provide reinforcement. I'll deliver the break. So we start by, again, keeping the dense schedule so the session is more green than it is red initially. So let's just say 1 minute of extinction, 9 minutes of reinforcement. Then after the client meets the criterion, whatever it is we set, let's just say it's 0 problem behavior for 2 consecutive sessions, right? They meet that criterion. Then we're going to go 2 minutes of red or extinction, 8 minutes of reinforcement. And eventually we're going to get to alternate these sort of signals, these cards indicating your response will be reinforced or it's not going to be reinforced. And what this does is it sort of loosely speaking provides information to the client such that they don't try responding, thereby their communication response sort of remains intact because they're only going to use it in the presence of green. So this is great because it can be generalized to a variety of settings as long as we incorporate these stimuli. And in this example, I'm using a red and green card. It could be anything. We'll talk about different variations of this in ABA 511 and perhaps even 512. Additional interventions that are sometimes paired with some of the things we just covered include response blocking and or redirection, right? And this is just a process by which we prevent responses from occurring. So if somebody's trying to hit you, you may block that response or gently move, block and push their hands back to their desk, right? Or if they engage in hand-to-head hitting, we may block the response, or head banging, we might block the response in some way. Okay, so these are sort of general strategies. You will review literature that includes these and you'll get a better idea of how they're actually implemented. But keep that in mind when you
start reviewing the articles in Java. So those are some antecedent-based interventions. Once again, I didn't give you great detail. I don't expect you to walk away being able to implement these. Certainly, you have enough information to know each of those interventions and know the basic process by which it works. So you want to, I expect you to probably review these things quite frequently to be prepared for the exam. But let's consider the antecedent-based intervention's strengths and limitations. Well, the strength is that these may be effective if you cannot identify the behavior function. So maybe it's a case that you've run several functional analyses and the results are unclear, but you do know the conditions under which behavior occurs. So you can manipulate those antecedents. Probably the major strength here is most antecedent interventions are easy to implement, right? Because it doesn't always require a lot of monitoring of the individual. And they're viewed as less restrictive. Now, we haven't really talked a lot about sort of the field of developmental disabilities at large, but there's a major emphasis on serving this population in a way that allows them choice, that doesn't place restrictions on their lives. So antecedent interventions are viewed as less restrictive, certainly less restrictive than, say, a timeout for problem behavior, right? So timeout is very restrictive. You are removing the individual from gaining access to reinforcement, thereby disrupting their life in some way, as opposed to manipulating some antecedent condition to prevent that problem behavior from ever occurring. So pretty important stuff there. The limitations obviously are we can't manipulate all antecedents. If we learn that problem behavior only occurs in the presence of teacher A and not teacher B, we may not be able to have teacher B teach all the time. Right, so we can't manipulate all antecedents. The other thing is generalization of treatment effects, or generalization and maintenance of treatment effects. If we adjust the environment, adjust antecedent stimuli within an environment, those adjustments don't exist in other environments, right? So that may limit the generality of the intervention. That is until we program for those changes to occur in every environment, if that's what's necessary. Okay, so that is it. There's a lot of content there. Please spend time familiarizing yourself with each of these interventions. Make sure you read the articles thoroughly. I expect you to have questions. So we'll have a chance to go through your questions next week during virtual session 5. So please prepare some questions for that session. Otherwise, have a good week.